The countdown. In Latin, Septuagesima means 70. Next Sunday, Sexagesima, 60. The following Sunday, Quinquagesima, 50. And then it brings us eventually into Quadragesima, 40, which gives us, in European languages like French and Italian, the root of Lent. But Lent in English comes from another root. It comes from the length root, because the days become a little longer in spring. It's the Old English word for spring, therefore. Therefore, the old writers maintained this gradual coming down and not a crash landing into Lent. It's a very ancient tradition, and I was still brought up in it, for in the Carthusian tradition it was still observed with regard to the changes in liturgy, at least with regard to the long midnight office. You may or may not know that until the bubonic plague, the monastic orders had in common a very long midnight office. It was with up to 12 lessons fully sung and 12 antiphons to go with them fully sung. That's Matins alone without Lauds, and then another Lauds with a big chunk following, which gave you a midnight office of 3 or 4 hours. Now, what happened, of course, was that the population of Europe was decimated in a few years, in 1347, 48, 49, with the terrible plague, the Black Plague. And only one order kept the midnight office with its integrity, the Carthusians. And so we had it, and we had actually the best choir in the order. Unfortunately, the house is now closed, and it was a good house for liturgy. The young voices, and they were very demanding, and great care was taken. So for hours on end, one had what? From Septuagesima Sunday onwards, Sunday after Sunday, with it coming again in the weekdays, the unfolding of salvation history from the year dot. It all started in principio, and one got therefore to the creation of man, formed de limo terre. Adam, by the way, means the red earth. The Adamach, that's the root of man. And so he was created, and he fell. And then we have the whole cycle of the fall and of the law coming in. And the question of the law is fairly central to this period of pre-Lent. So I want to stop there for a second, because it's the backdrop to what Lent is actually about. We have the putting right of things and the new lawgiver, Christ our Saviour, coming to teach. The law. You may remember that the first version was written by the hand of God himself. And as Moses came down, he was horrified. He heard this dancing going on, and they were worshipping an idol that they had created in his absence, this golden calf. In fury, he broke the sacred tablets written by the finger of God, and eventually went back up the Holy Mount, and he had to write them himself. He came down with the same message, eventually after another 40-day period, and the tablets of the law would have been placed in the Ark of the Covenant, along with the manna and the rod of Aaron which burgeoned. This writing of 10 words, the Decalogue, logos is a word, by the finger of God, is not something relative. Moreover, it is written by that same finger of God in the heart of man. For if one looks over the planet into any culture, essentially, one finds a trace of it in the law of conscience. For the moral law is also a proof of the supreme lawgiver and creator. The fact that we all have it and sort of know things indicates that there's a brain behind it, and also means that none of us is without excuse, for we know secretly what is right and what is not right. I want to stop for a second at this question of these thousands upon thousands of souls that went suddenly into the beyond at that time. A trace of it, by the way, is in the cathedral where I was ordained. If you look at the Cathedral of Siena, you will see it is similar to that of Florence, the other rival. Siena wanted a bigger cathedral, so they had started to think of having the present cathedral as only one wing of it, and to have a massive thing built bigger than Florence. They started, and the bubonic plague came. So if you look at what's there, you will see this new bit coming up, left in midair without a roof, teaching man his size. Man proposes, God disposes. But the cathedral has gone on. And there's it, just opposite the cathedral, a skull, a real skull, which looks at you, and you look back at it, and it says in old Italian, "As you are, so once was I. As I am, so will you also be." That, my friends, means you too. For bubonic plague, war, cancer, accident, whatever it may be, we're not that far from their company. So this moment of Septuagesima is also a countdown to our reckoning. Did you notice in the first reading that we have to do with, as it were, a combat? The stadium, the pugilarius, fighting not against the air. But these were fighting for a laurel. But Paul is fighting for the crown that does not pass away. Do you remember the great pugilarius Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali? "I am the greatest." Well, he defended his people. He did all he could to show that his race was equal. He meant business. Right now, there are people all over Ireland who are trying their best to score at the exams. The mocks are at them, and then it'll be the real thing, and then university. But suppose that they get a first. Suppose they go to the most brilliant college they can. Suppose they become professors and miss the final exam. Quid hoc ad eternitatem. What use is this before eternity? The one exam that counts is heaven, and no one can escape it. Say what you like. Those who faced death at an early age in the time of the bubonic plague, they took it very seriously and they risked getting to heaven. The proof is this. Look over the things depicted at that time, even the music coming out of it. Tragic, macabre dances, skeletons dancing, the pauper in hand with the prince and the king and the bishop. Death, the great equalizer. They knew what it meant. We, in our day, think that we've grown up. And with the smile of so-called reason, we look back and think how thick and credulous they were. Of course, hell doesn't exist. How could it? God is infinite mercy. Blaise Pascal put it this way, neutrally as a philosopher. Who thinks that he can get away with cancelling this from his life might actually look at it in this way. Two cases he puts before our eyes as a philosopher. The specimen before me is immortal or mortal. His body is mortal, but because what is spiritual is immortal, the big part of him goes on. So none can escape the question. Right. That candidate for eternity has therefore before him this choice. He will use his life, his time, in this moment of time that we call life, with this choice before him. I will, A, behave as though there's no risk. I will enjoy myself. I don't believe, therefore it doesn't bother me. Or, B, I will presume that there is a risk. And therefore I will make a bet, the wager, the famous wager of Blaise Pascal. I will, in this life, do as though it were there. For of the two, one has an awful lot more to lose than the other. You see how pagan, or rather neutral philosophy is very wise. And before the fact of our immortal soul comes to this conclusion, we can't afford to presume that not to believe will cancel the problem, because what we believe does not change one iota of the problem. It is there or not there. What does the pulpit of the modern media tell you? Come off it, grow up. And therefore, at you all day long and all night, you'll have pumped at you from the media the other equation. It doesn't exist. And in any case, we've grown up. There's no problem. 1 second after death, often anticipated for whatever reason, the eyes are opened. Just the other day, here in Navan, a young father of family in the storm. It was Sunday, I believe, a week today, was in a state of merriness, I believe, but actually lost his phone. But it went into the boyne, which was overflowing. But his phone was important to him, so he went to look for his phone, and of course never came back from the boyne, leaving a wife and 3 young children behind for his phone. The phone! The phone! Before eternity. And that's what's happening, my friend. Our life is being swallowed up by this thing, so that all eternity is cancelled from the equation. I would like to conclude with a reference to one author who may be thought to be outmoded, but whose feast happens to be today. Our dear angelic doctor. In the Angelicum named after him, he was very much honoured and felt his presence in the air. St. Thomas Aquinas. In our monastery in Italy, our prior wanted us to be very much steeped in Thomas Aquinas. I still have with me in Latin the full Summa, and he wanted us to be reading the Summa every day. And whatever happens, tools, it gives you this: the machinery for tackling a problem. There's one thing that Thomas has. He sees the power of reason, and he Christianizes a pagan philosopher, whom he calls just the philosopher, Aristotle, because truth is truth, and all belongs to the Logos. And with regard to this, he says this: essentially, the things that belong to eternity. The fire of purgatory and the fire of hell are the same. Do you see what that means? It's very serious, the question. Septuagesima came out with this before she died. She was given to understand by supernatural means that 3 hours in purgatory was the equivalent in our terms of 3,000 years of life. Does that somehow ring a bell with regard to what matters and what matters less? With regard to scoring in the exam hall, on the football field, actually in one's love life. Moreover, she was given to understand one thing that hurt terribly in purgatory. And this concerns each of us here: the abuse of the day of the Lord. They suffer terribly for having put aside the day of the Lord. And now, even practicing Christians manage to do away without the day of the Lord itself being honoured by having it all anticipated on a Saturday evening. What does that tell you about priorities? Also, she was given to understand how horrible it was, the abuse of language, and how much of that goes on from ear to ear, Lent to Lent. Things never weeded out of our vocabulary, even among the consecrated. A little bit of swearing, it makes us virile. Oh, my friends, a virile soul is one who has the courage to own up to his misery.